What if I told you that some secrets buried in cemeteries were never meant to stay hidden? What if the very ground beneath your feet was keeping a terrifying truth? Everyone thinks a cemetery is a place of rest, but it's actually a place of waiting. And the gardeners who work there at night, they know it better than anyone. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? But you'll be shocked to learn the truth. Cemeteries don't just house the dead. They guard something far darker, something more dangerous, something the dead never wanted you to know. You've probably walked through a cemetery at night before, right? But have you ever felt the air change? Ever felt like someone or something was watching you? The truth is, some of the gardeners working those graves don't leave at dawn. Some of them don't even leave at all. Curious yet? You should be. Because the stories of what really happens after the sun sets in these graveyards will shake you to your core. And no, it's not just your imagination. Get ready. What you're about to hear might change everything you thought you knew about cemeteries and the things that still walk among us. Grim tales from cemetery night gardeners. The cemetery was always quiet at night, a silence that felt almost sacred. But for the night gardeners, it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, even when you were just walking between the tombstones, tending to the graves. Every night, they walked the same path, their footsteps echoing against the cold, stone ground. The moonlight cast long, unsettling shadows that danced on the graves, and the air always seemed thicker, heavier, as if something unseen was watching. But no one really ever spoke about the things they saw during their late-night shifts. Things that didn't belong. That was until one of them, a man named Jack, couldn't keep the secret anymore. Jack had been working as a night gardener for nearly 10 years. He knew every corner of the cemetery. He'd seen the families bury their loved ones, the mourners grieving, and the occasional vandalism that had to be cleaned up. But nothing had ever prepared him for what he would encounter one late autumn night. It was just past midnight when Jack was walking along the east side of the cemetery near the old chapel. The wind had picked up, rattling the old trees, and Jack's footsteps became the only sound in the graveyard. That's when he heard it, the soft whisper of a voice, almost a humming, coming from one of the graves. He thought it was just the wind, but as he moved closer, the humming grew louder, clearer. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't coming from the earth or the wind. It was coming from a woman whose grave was long forgotten. Her tombstone was cracked, covered in layers of moss, and the name on it had long faded into obscurity. But that night, it seemed to come alive. Jack, drawn by curiosity and fear, approached the grave. As he reached out to touch the weathered stone, he felt it, a cold, clammy hand clasping around his wrist. He yanked his hand back, but the pressure remained. Someone was still holding on to him from beneath the earth. He tried to pull away, but it felt like the ground itself was pulling him in. His heart raced as he fought to free himself, and in the struggle, the humming turned into a faint, guttural whisper. "Help me." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The whisper wasn't just from any grave. It was from her grave, the woman who had been buried. There was not at rest, and somehow she was still waiting for someone to listen. But Jack couldn't stay. He tore himself away from the grave, stumbling back, his breath shallow, as he turned to run. The moonlight cast one final glow on the gravestone, and for the briefest moment, he swore he saw the woman's figure standing at the edge of the grave, her eyes glowing like hollow pits. The cemetery was silent once more, but Jack knew something he couldn't ignore. Some graves weren't meant to be disturbed, and some spirits were never meant to rest. From that night on, Jack never worked alone in the cemetery. and he never spoke of what happened to anyone. But the whispering, the humming, it never stopped, and neither did the feeling that someone or something was always watching. As weeks passed, Jack's unease grew. The whispering was no longer just something he heard at night. He began to feel it, an icy breath on his neck during the quietest moments of his shift. He could no longer walk the cemetery without the sensation of eyes watching him from the shadows, always just out of sight. One particular evening, Jack was working the furthest corner of the cemetery, near an old iron gate that led to a forgotten section, where the oldest graves were buried. This area had been abandoned for years, overgrown with vines, and most of the gravestones were half submerged in earth. Only the bravest dared to walk there. As he knelt to pull weeds from a particularly overgrown grave, Jack noticed something strange. One of the gravestones, the one closest to the gate, was disturbed. The soil around it was freshly turned, as if someone had recently been digging. But no one else was supposed to be there. The cemetery had been locked since dusk, and Jack had been working alone. Curiosity and dread mixed in his chest as he approached the grave. He bent down to inspect it, brushing aside the thick vines that had grown around the stone. The name carved into the gravestone was clear. This was the grave of Samuel Blackwood, a man who had died nearly 150 years ago. The grave itself was not special, just another marker of someone long forgotten. But as Jack looked closer, he saw it, a faint trail of blood, dry but unmistakable, leading from the grave into the surrounding woods. Against his better judgment, Jack followed the trail. It was faint, almost invisible in the moonlight, but it led him deeper into the shadows. With each step, the air grew heavier, colder. The sound of rustling leaves, the faint hum of the wind, it all seemed to stop, as though the forest itself held its breath. Then, as Jack reached the edge of the trees, something changed. He saw movement, something quick and dark, darting just out of sight. His heart began to race, and his hand instinctively reached for the pocket knife he kept with him. He turned, looking over his shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following him. There was nothing. Jack turned back to face the trail of blood, but now it seemed to be fading away, as though the earth itself had begun to erase its presence. The woods were quiet once more. No more humming, no more whispers, just the distant howl of the wind and the pressure in the air that told him to leave. But something pulled him forward. He couldn't explain it, but something was beckoning him further. And against every instinct in his body, he took another step, another, until he found himself standing in front of a small, abandoned shack, hidden deep within the trees. The door creaked as if pushed by an unseen hand, swinging open just enough to reveal a dim light flickering inside. Jack hesitated, but only for a moment, driven by an insatiable need to know what was happening in that cemetery. He stepped inside. Inside the shack, there were old, rotting furniture, shattered mirrors, and in the center, a wooden box. The air was thick with a stench, like something long dead. And then Jack saw it, something that made his blood run cold. On top of the box was a small, worn photograph. A photograph of a young woman standing in front of a gravestone he recognized. It was the same gravestone from the cemetery. Jack's pulse quickened as his eyes darted to the box. His hand trembled as he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the lid. The moment his touch made contact, the temperature dropped. The air became thick with the sound of whispers, hundreds of them, all at once, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The lid of the box flew open, and from within, a pair of hollow eyes stared back at him, glowing in the darkness. Some things are meant to stay buried. Some secrets are too terrible to be uncovered. And some spirits will follow you no matter how far you run. Next time you walk through a cemetery, remember this tale. And remember, you're never really alone. The days that follow were uneventful, at least on the surface. Jack continued his shifts at the cemetery, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The whispers, the cold, the shadows. It was as if the cemetery itself had become a living, breathing entity, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He couldn't stop thinking about that box in the shack, about the eyes that stared at him from within. No matter how hard he tried to push it from his mind, the image lingered like a stain that wouldn't wash away. And so, 1 week later, Jack found himself back at the cemetery. This time, not to work, but to confront whatever had been haunting him. It was just before dusk when he arrived, the cemetery gates creaking open as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the trees seemed to sway unnaturally, as though something moved beneath the branches. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he walked toward the old, forgotten section, the place where he'd first encountered the disturbance. The air felt heavier than it ever had before. As he approached Samuel Blackwood's grave, a chill ran through him, the ground beneath his feet suddenly feeling unstable. He knelt by the grave and touched the cold stone once more. And there it was, the faintest trace of blood still lingering at the edge of the marker. As if time had stood still, the blood hadn't washed away. It was as though someone or something was waiting for Jack to find it again. He stood up quickly, shaking his head as if to clear it. He wasn't sure what he was doing or why he felt compelled to come back. But before he could turn to leave, a sound reached his ears. A whisper, no louder than the rustling of leaves, but unmistakably close. He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. It came again, this time a word he recognized. "Help!" Jack spun around, his heart racing. But there was nothing there. No one. Just a cold, empty cemetery with its overgrown graves and shifting shadows. Yet, in the distance, he saw a figure, a tall, hunched shape, moving swiftly through the trees. It was as if the figure knew he was watching, because it paused just for a moment and then disappeared into the dark. Without thinking, Jack took off running. His feet hit the ground harder with every step. But the figure was always one step ahead of him, slipping just beyond his line of sight. He reached the old shack at the edge of the cemetery, the same place he had uncovered the box. It was no longer abandoned. The door was wide open, as though inviting him inside. He approached cautiously, his breath shallow and quick. The air around him felt charged with strange energy. The whispers were louder now, like voices calling from the very walls of the shack. Jack stepped inside, the floor creaking under his weight. And there, in the center of the room, was the box again. It hadn't moved, but this time the lid was open, empty. Before Jack could react, he felt a hand on his shoulder, cold, clammy, and unmistakably real. He spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers intensified, filling his ears, drowning out everything else. "Help me," the voice repeated, now unmistakably urgent. Jack's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source, but all he could see was the darkness closing in around him. The ground beneath him felt like it was shifting. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. He backed away, his breath ragged, the whispers now all-consuming. He stumbled out of the shack, his legs weak from the fear that had overtaken him. He looked around, desperate for an escape, But the cemetery felt endless, its tombstones towering over him like silent sentinels. The air was thick with a presence that was almost tangible. Suddenly, there was a sound, a low, guttural moan rising from the ground. It seemed to come from everywhere, filling the space with a deep, resonating tone. And then Jack saw it, rising from the grave of Samuel Blackwood, the earth shifting and moving as though something was pushing its way to the surface. The figure appeared slowly, its face a blur of shadows, its body twisted and misshapen. Jack could only watch in horror as the figure rose higher, its hollow eyes locked onto his. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were voices, many voices, all speaking at once, demanding something from him, something he couldn't understand. And then, in a voice that cut through the chaos, one word echoed to the cemetery: "Leave." Jack turned and ran as fast as he could, the figure's presence following him like a dark cloud. He didn't stop until he reached the gates of the cemetery, where the whispers finally ceased, leaving him breathless, trembling, and alone. But as he stood there, panting and disoriented, he realized something. The cemetery wasn't finished with him. He had escaped, yes, but only for now. The whispers, the figures, the spirits, they were still out there, waiting for someone to listen. And Jack knew, deep down, that he would never truly escape. Because in a cemetery like this, once you're noticed, you're never truly free.